Hi everyone, Paul here. One of the things that I remember most clearly about growing up in the 1960s was a transformation in experience afforded to people in shops and galleries, and even to a certain extent in the street. Perhaps the most striking example of this that I can describe is my first experience of going to Madame Tussauds. Must have been before 1966, so I was probably 8 years old, something like that. And I remember very vividly that the experience of going to Madame Tussauds back then was very much as it would have been in about 1920. For example, the Kings and Queens of Britain exhibition was laid out in chronological order, with figures of the kings and queens laid out around the perimeter of the room, with the present royal family presented on a stage or dais in the centre of the room. And it was all very grand but very stolid and static and not very exciting. And then there were some celebrity models and so on. And then the next time I went to Madame Tussauds, probably a few years later, towards the end of the 60s, the whole environment had been transformed into one in which the figures had come in from the sides of the room and had begun to populate the floor, and the exhibition was organised in a much more immersive and dynamic way. And this was most noticeable in the repositioning of their famous waxwork set piece or tableau of the death of Nelson, which is taken from the famous painting of Nelson on his deathbed with Captain Hardy. And this is a famous model that had been created, I think, by Madame Tussauds herself at the beginning of the 19th century to mark the death of Nelson, which was a profound national event. And this model was represented so that it was arrived at after a journey through the Victory battleship during the Battle of Trafalgar. So you went down through the gun decks with guns roaring and the soundtrack and the smell of gunpowder, what we imagined was gunpowder, until eventually you reached the model and it became much more lifelike and realistic and exciting because of that. Well, the same thing happened in shops. That was a long way round getting to shops, and I've spoken before about Terence Conran and Bieber and the enormous and dramatic changes that occurred in shops during the 60s. And one of the people who contributed to that in a very important way was someone called Liz Farrow, who sadly has just died. And I knew Liz because she was already dealing in historic advertising, posters, metal signs, ephemera, all of that kind of stuff in 1980, when I first began to become interested in the history of advertising and posters, graphic design and so on. So she was a pioneer, and she was a pioneer from the 1960s when she was at the forefront of this movement to create a more dynamic and interesting experience for people in shops, restaurants, hotels and so on. And just as Terence Conran had gone to France and discovered the world of utilitarian ceramics and metalware and simple things done well, Liz had travelled and was definitely susceptible to the excitement and nostalgic appeal of old graphics. And this was something that had come, I think, from the developing sensibility towards pop art that had emerged in the late 1950s and grew during the 1960s. The launch of pop art was really this exhibition at the Whitechapel Gallery. This was an exhibition of work by different artists, designers and architects that were part of the independent group. The independent group didn't meet at Whitechapel, it met at the ICA in Soho. And the ICA in the early part of the 50s was the wellspring for the kind of intellectual, philosophical debate about modern art, society, culture, architecture, all of those things. It was a real place to hang out, and a series of discussions were held within the ICA about the future of the arts in Britain. And one of the key drivers for this was that within the context of post-war regeneration, the rebuilding of Britain, the engine room of the fine arts should become much more closely aligned with the street and with popular energy rather than with the salon and the more elevated tastes of the aristocracy or some other segment of society. And different people responded in different ways to this desire to re-energise society with a democratic spirit. And Liz, I think, found evidence of that democratic spirit in advertising in ephemera and in the promise of a better future that was evident in the images of early advertising. Of course, things haven't always turned out as we hoped they would, and so our understanding of these images from the past is freighted with an acknowledgement that the world that we're in is in some ways different from the world as it was imagined back then. I mean, that's like looking at the world of cars in the 1930s and thinking about where we are now. So Liz Farrow played a key role in that, and I was lucky enough to meet Liz. She was very friendly and was always really brilliant at finding stuff. She was a pioneer in hunting out food economy posters from France for aperitifs and for packets of noodles and that kind of thing, which she then pitched to the burgeoning restaurant scene in London and so on. So there was a stage, I think, probably at some point in the 1980s when practically every restaurant in London had posters supplied by Liz Farrow on the walls. And that was an impressive achievement. So thank you, Liz. Bye, everyone.